Have you ever been miserable? If so, this is a lesson for you today. This is for all the miserable people. Of all the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph was the most blessed son. He was the brightest, he was a natural-born leader, and he could even explain the meaning of dreams. And he was also his father Jacob's favorite son. In his later years, Jacob had an encounter with God, and he changed his name to Israel. So the 12 sons of the man Jacob would become the 12 tribes of the man Israel. It's important to remember that Israel is a person, not a country. And Joseph, or Israel's favorite son, also seemed to be God's favorite too. Joseph will be the means by which God will show his blessing to all the children of Israel. And what do I mean by God's blessing? Well, last week we heard the story of how God had said to Joseph's great-grandfather Abraham, "I will bless you so that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. I will multiply your generations as many as the stars, and I will give you a land and make you a great nation. And when I have planted you at the center of the earth, your mission will be to tell the whole world about me, that I am the Lord and there is no other. And people will listen to you because they will see how blessed that I have made you, and you will be a blessing to the whole world." Now, Abraham never saw any of that come true. But the Bible shows us how everything God had promised would be fulfilled. And this week we see how God's plan is coming true in Joseph. And even though Joseph has no idea what is going on in the bigger picture, he will do as much to further God's plan and promise as did Moses or King David. But there's a great irony in this story of Joseph, because most of the time, blessed Joseph didn't feel blessed at all. In fact, much of his life was miserable. And to him, it seemed like his life was one disaster after another. Because Joseph was his father's favorite son, and because he knew it, his brothers were jealous. One day they got fed up with him and they beat him up, and they sold him to human traffickers and told his father he was dead. And then Joseph was dragged to Egypt in chains and dragged along, knowing you have no idea where he would go or what his fate would be. And if you were Joseph, how do you think you would feel? Miserable. Certainly not blessed by God. But Joseph's misfortune is exactly what God uses to bring about his plan. He gets Joseph to Egypt, and later through Joseph he gets the whole family there, and it is in the safety of Egypt that the children of Israel would grow and multiply beyond anything anyone imagined, so much so that one day even the Pharaoh would fear them. And in Egypt, the Israelites would not only multiply, but by the misery of slavery itself, they would be toughened and share a common memory that united them. In the generations afterwards, they would say again and again, "Remember, you were slaves together in Egypt." And they would learn to trust God for their very life. And all that happened because Joseph was sold as a slave and dragged to Egypt. So Joseph's whole life was a blessing, but he didn't see it. In fact, for a good deal of his life, he was miserable. And that's how this lesson speaks to us today. It says, I think, several things to us. It reminds us that faith is a journey, as it was for Joseph. His story of his life was one transition after another. And secondly, and I love this one, just because you are miserable doesn't mean you are not blessed. Because God has a plan and things are not always what they seem. So hang in there. And thirdly, and I love this, God can often turn the worst parts of your life, into your greatest treasure. So here is the part of the story that we hear about Joseph in our lesson today. When Joseph was dragged to Egypt, he was sold to a particularly tough owner, a man named Potiphar, who was the head of the Egyptian secret police, and who was also in charge of a dungeon for political prisoners, which was in the basement of his palace. Potiphar was a very scary man. Now, it's also probably true to say that Joseph had been spoiled. He was a cocky little kid. His father indulged him. And one of the reasons his brothers hated him so much was that he had attitude. He knew how good he was, and he was, in the vernacular, a smart little jerk. But Potiphar took nothing from anyone. And of course, he was brutal to Joseph. And Joseph was miserable under Potiphar's rule. Woe is me. Why has God done this to me? But what Joseph could not see was how God was using his ministry for a plan, his misery for a plan. Joseph had to learn Egyptian. He had to learn the ways of Egyptian society. He had to learn his place and to be quiet and tactful, and especially to be deeply respectful of the Pharaoh and the people under him. He had to learn to be trustworthy and to be loyal to Potiphar. And all of these things he would need later. So this miserable experience in Potiphar's house would become his treasure. Remember that Joseph carried the blessing from God, and he certainly didn't feel blessed. And yet everything he did prospered. And as the years went by, Potiphar came to trust him and rely on him, because he was like the golden boy. The more of Potiphar's affairs he handled, the more Potiphar prospered. So Joseph eventually came to run the whole palace and all of its affairs. And then for a little while, things seemed to be going well. But not for long. Because Potiphar, the head of the secret police, was very busy, and the Pharaoh often had him running all over the country, which meant he neglected his wife. And the attractive, successful, smart golden boy Joseph was there and visible in the house all the time. And it doesn't take too much to put two and two together. Potiphar's wife wanted him, and the whole staff saw it. She flirted and swooned and even begged and pleaded. But Joseph was smart enough and loyal enough not to betray the head of the secret police. He said no, 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 no. And eventually her attraction turned to hate. And as our lesson tells us today, she grabs his robe and he runs off without it to get away. But she keeps the robe and uses it as evidence to falsely accuse him of trying to attack her. And poor Joseph again. Woe is me. I haven't done anything wrong. I have done everything right. Why is God doing this to me? And when Potiphar gets back, he blows up. And Joseph is thrown in the dungeon in the basement and will stay there for years and years. A miserable, miserable place. But many scholars do note, though, that the punishment seems pretty light. I mean, given the crime of attacking his wife, the fact that Joseph is still alive with his head on is almost a miracle. So God did protect him. But scholars kind of suspect that even Potiphar found his wife's story a little shaky. I mean, the whole household had seen her behavior. And so while he couldn't call her a liar, he only had Joseph locked up in the basement dungeon. And it seems as if Joseph still administered many of Potiphar's affairs from the prison, and that Potiphar was not going to give up his gravy train in spite of his anger. But again, Joseph is miserable. He hadn't done a thing. He did all the right things. So why did he have to rot in a dungeon for years, maybe even the rest of his life? How could God do this to him? And I think it's important to feel the depth of Joseph's pain at this moment. Because maybe you have been there in a prison like that. There are so many people who experience terrible disappointments, grave injustices, the loss of everything, and who feel hopeless and trapped, and who are apt to feel like Joseph. How could you do this to me, God? Why did you let this happen? And why won't you help me now? Get me out of this prison. And yet, in Joseph's life, it seems like every disaster is the reason why, is the means by which something very good will happen next. And it could only have happened because of the mess. While Joseph is in prison, he interprets some dreams correctly. And eventually he meets a fellow prisoner, a cupbearer, who tasted the Pharaoh's wine. And the cupbearer will tell the Pharaoh about Joseph and his ability to interpret dreams. And the Pharaoh will fetch Joseph from prison, and Joseph will use everything he has learned so far, his Egyptian language, his respect, his loyalty, his amazing clarity, and his ability to interpret dreams and to predict the future. All of that he learned from the disasters in his life, and he will use all those things to so impress the Pharaoh that the Pharaoh will appoint him as the administrator of all the granaries of Egypt. And Joseph becomes the right-hand man of the Pharaoh. And Joseph will make the Pharaoh the richest, most secure nation in all the world. And when his own family comes to Egypt to buy grain during the great famine, Joseph will forgive his brothers and invite them to stay in Egypt. And the rest of the amazing plan of God will play out. And so this is a lesson for blessed, miserable people. A lesson that says, when you are miserable, things are not what they seem. That God often uses the worst experiences in your life to become your greatest treasures. Faith is a journey. The best of us are often the most miserable. So hang in there. When God is at work, things are not always what they seem. God can take your trash and make it a treasure. Amen.